Let us return to Munich and that major security conference dominated by Ukraine. It represents one of the most consequential meetings in decades after Donald Trump stunned allies with his phone call to Vladimir Putin on Wednesday and his plans to negotiate with Moscow to end the war. Well, that left many Europeans accusing the US of Russian appeasement. So let's recap where we are at the end of this week. The US Vice President J.D. Vance has warned Russia that it might impose economic sanctions if the country refused to agree what he called a good peace deal with Ukraine. Later, he told the gathering there's a new sheriff in town in Washington. But some senior American senators at the conference have called for the US to continue arming Ukraine, with one advising Mr. Trump not to be afraid of Moscow. Well, President Zelensky said he didn't believe the US has a plan for peace yet, and that Ukraine will never recognise the occupied territories as Russian. And he insisted his country does still want to join NATO. Meanwhile, Germany's president said Europe had to accept that President Trump's administration wouldn't respect established rules of trusted relationships in international politics. A reminder that President Zelensky is currently meeting with the US president. When there's either pictures or comment, we'll bring that immediately to you here on the programme. But in the last, hour and a half, we've heard from Ukraine's president. He responded to the suggestion that Donald Trump was emboldening Vladimir Putin.
I had good conversation with the President Trump. We had some phone calls, and he had phone call with Putin, and he said to me, I think that that he wants to stop the war. I said to him that he is a liar, and you can count on it. I hope that you will pressure him because I don't trust him. We had such conversations with Putin, direct conversation about ceasefire. But he will not just, ceasefire and that's all. That's why I said to President, yes, but I think phone calls are phone calls. Let's forget about it. I think what is very important, the meeting, not to make any decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine. This is principal position we will never accept it. And when I said that we will never accept, I'm not speaking just about me. I'm speaking about all our people, all our nation. People will not stop. We will give him pause. Without the real security guarantees, we will give him pause. I don't want to, be those person in the history who helped Putin to occupy my country. I don't want it. And that's why I will never do it. I will never do it. And it's very important for me to pressure Putin, put all the sanctions. I think President Trump is ready to do it. He has all this power to do it.
Well, that was President Zelensky speaking at that town hall in the last hour or so. Also there was the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who was asked if he was comfortable with Donald Trump doing deals with authoritarian leaders like President Putin before consulting European allies. Here's what he said.
It doesn't matter to me who Trump calls or when he calls. It matters to me how it ends. Afghanistan ended poorly. Do you all agree with that? Well, this will not end poorly. President Trump is not going to do in Ukraine what we did in Afghanistan. He's going to try to find a way to make sure this war ends sooner rather than later. And when I talk to people about at home why it matters, Putin won't stop unless somebody stops him. Well, you're stopping him. But he'll keep going unless we get the conditions right. So here's what I think is going to happen. I think he's going to find a way to end this war in a fashion that Putin would be a fool to do it again. Very quickly. How do you deter Putin? You arm this guy to the teeth. Yeah, you give him a bunch of F-16s, not a few F-16s. You give him ATACMS, you give him tanks, because they will fight. Remind me not to invade Ukraine, okay? It just doesn't work out well. So let's arm this guy. Let's do the minerals agreement so we'll have our American business interests. Putin doesn't understand what's going on. If we sign this minerals agreement, Putin is screwed, because Trump will defend the deal. So the best thing that's going to happen here is he's going to do a deal with you, I hope, and he will defend America's interest. So this war is going to come to end, I hope, sooner rather than later, and it's going to come to end in a way where it won't happen again. I have every confidence in the world that Donald Trump will end this war in a way that there will be no third invasion of Ukraine.
Well, that was Lindsey Graham. Now in Poland, the US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth has held talks with his Polish counterpart, and he repeated his warning that Europe had to take more responsibility for their own security and that Ukraine joining NATO was, quote, unlikely.
So my job today and in Brussels was to introduce realism to the conversation. The reality that returning to 2014 as borders as part of a negotiated settlement is unlikely. The reality of U.S. troops in Ukraine is unlikely. The reality of Ukraine membership in NATO as a part of a negotiated settlement, unlikely. And I stand by the comments that I made on that first day in the Ukraine contact group. And that's for all the press out there who it's difficult for them to understand that. We stand by the statements we made in reality about the status of U.S. forces or or Ukraine's involvement in NATO and the unlikely nature of that. That said, I would never put constraints around what the President of the United States would be willing to negotiate with the sovereign leaders of both Russia and Ukraine.
Well, after meeting with the German president a little earlier in the day, the US Vice President J.D. Vance addressed that same conference in Munich and provoked anger after accusing European countries of backsliding on free speech.
So I come here today not just with an observation, but with an offer. And just as the Biden administration seemed desperate to silence people for speaking their minds, so the Trump administration will do precisely the opposite, and I hope that we can work together on that. In Washington, there is a new sheriff in town, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer it in the public square, agree or disagree.
Well, that was J.D. Vance. He is currently meeting with President Zelensky. Let's speak to Ukraine's former President Petro Poroshenko. He joins me live from Kyiv. And thank you so much for being here on BBC News. Let me start by asking you, how worried are you that Donald Trump might try to negotiate an end to this war without Ukraine being there at the table?
This is unacceptable. And I don't believe that the President Trump will do that, because I worked with the President Trump for 3 years. And I know for sure that if we have a plan and have a scenario, President Trump will definitely keep it. And there is no any plan of General Kellogg or National Security Advisor Vance or Vice President Vance. There is a plan of President Trump. And one of the key points for this plan is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. This is the principle I established, and I worked with Trump during the time of my president term. And nothing about Europe without Europe. This is also a key point. And with that situation, you cannot find out any other nation in the world who wants peace more than we Ukrainians, because we pay highest price for that.
Mr. Poroshenko,
but we have
I hate to interrupt you, but we're just getting the feed of the pictures of Zelensky and the US Vice President. I'm just going to play that on the screen.
For reading. Thank you, colleagues. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you all. Take care, guys.
How is this move forward if Ukraine is not ready to come to the table with Putin? If Ukraine is not ready to speak with Putin at the table, how do you move forward? Will you still negotiate?
Well, look, I think the way that this conversation moves us forward is, first of all, you have great members of the Ukrainian delegation. You have our incredible Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, here. We have General Kellogg. It's important for us to get together and start to have the conversations that are going to be necessary to bring this thing to a close. That's all I'm going to say for now, because I want to preserve the optionality here from the negotiators and our respective teams to bring this thing to a responsible close. Thank you all, and have a good night.
What is the timeline of this Have you come to a deal on
I actually can't hear you when you all shout at once. See you guys. Have a good night.
Well, an absolute avalanche of questions with those two leaders not saying any more, as I suspect the cameras are going to be ushered out of that room in the next few seconds. But you heard from J.D. Vance, you heard very briefly from President Zelensky. So that meeting, the pictures, they'll now get down to real talk. So a little later, I suspect we'll get a little more from those two leaders. Petro Poroshenko, apologies to break away. That was important. Just to show our viewers what is currently happening in Munich. You were talking about Ukraine needing to be there at the negotiating table. Were you concerned to hear Donald Trump earlier in the week appear to make really obvious concessions, which was that there would be no NATO membership from Ukraine, his defence secretary saying they would not go back to the borders of 2014. Did that worry you when you heard some of those things even before the negotiations start to end this war?
I can declare you the absolutely crystal clear Ukrainian position. I want to remind you with the words of the President Reagan, then we maintain peace through strength. Exactly this phrase was used in the President Trump, because peace through weakness is only invite the aggression. We have a five non-compromise point, 5 red lines. Point number 1, this is no compromise on the sovereignty and national identity of Ukraine. We never be the Russian colony. Point number 2, non-compromise on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Point number 3, non-compromise on the armed forces of Ukraine and it limits, because this is the guarantee for existing of Ukrainian sovereign independent states. Point number 4, non-compromise on sanction, because this is the strong motivation for Putin to keep him at the table of negotiation. And point number 5, non-compromise on NATO and EU. And President Trump is absolutely right. I hate the idea that we will discuss the NATO membership of Ukraine with Putin. Putin shouldn't have any veto right and any red light. This is the 30 NATO member states' position and position of Ukrainian people. I'm proud that I'm introducing Ukrainian constitution, the future membership of Ukraine in NATO. And with that situation, definitely.
I hear your 5 points. It'll be interesting to see how much of that is taken on board by the Americans and how much may in the end be wishful thinking. But if Ukraine has to make compromises, what compromises do you think you could make?
Everything else outside of these 5 points is possible. I think that we can erase any obstacle. We should believe in our victory. And with that situation, I really count on President Trump. And for having that, we should bring Ukraine to negotiations stronger. We should have weapons, long-range missile, air defense, and with this situation, we should understand that this is at stake. Ukrainian exists. Does we
but do you think it's likely to
Ukrainian state, or will be destroyed?
Do you think it's likely to get more sanctions, more weapons, or really unlikely given everything that has come from the current White House? I mean, do you think that's really possible going into any sort of negotiations to get more armaments, more sanctions?
I don't even think about that. I'm confident in that because I know for sure Putin don't want peace. Don't trust Putin. Don't expect that Putin will accept the position of Ukraine or position of President Trump, or I hope joint position. We have only one condition when we can reach the results to make negotiation position stronger. And if Putin do not accept, Trump should be decisive enough to give us more weapons, to give us more sanctions, to make us strengthen transatlantic unity, and to keep democracy and reform in Ukraine, to keep the support of Ukraine. And I was the president of the country in a state of war, and if you don't believe in your victory, nothing happens. You will lose.
What would happen if the deal put to Ukraine and put to Vladimir Putin is basically the territory that Russia has taken, they keep, and some sort of long format of a status is then talked about? Is that acceptable or unacceptable?
We will not accept any loss of Ukrainian territory. Point number 1. Point number 2. I kindly
What happens, though, before we get to point number 2, what happens if that is the deal that's presented to you?
we do not accept official status of Ukrainian occupied territory as a Russian territory. I want to remind you that I signed, together with President Trump, so-called Pompeo Declaration on the Crimea and other occupied territory. And there was absolutely strong message from President Trump that United States never recognized any occupied Ukrainian territory. I am absolutely confident that
if
this
that,
will
though, let me put a question to you, though. If that is part of the deal that is put to Ukraine, and that is what Donald Trump actually considers is the plan, what choice does Ukraine have? Because you can't continue this war without the Americans, can you?
Absolutely. But we cannot lose this war. And again, please learn the lesson 1938 in Munich, and think that if it would be appeasement for the aggressor, that would be losing, that would be defeat of the country. And I know for sure President Trump, he never accept the scenario then he will lose. And I strongly support Make America Great Again. I'm really happy make Europe great again and make Ukraine great again. Not Russia. Make Russia small again.
One more question. One more question then. Do you accept now that NATO membership is not going to happen?
Yeah, because this is the homework for Ukraine. We should prepare our country for NATO, not only by military means, but also by means of democracy, means of freedom, means rule of law, means fundamental, means fighting against corruption. We have a lots of things to be done. And with this position, I want to just have one principal fact. The future membership of Ukraine in NATO should be on the table. We have door of NATO open for us since year 2008 with the Bucharest summit of NATO.
Sure, but you've heard what the US Defense Secretary said. He said it again today. He's in no doubt that it's unrealistic.
I think that it is before meeting with Putin. And I don't believe that Putin will effectively cooperate for implementation of President Trump's plan. And with this situation, I think it was a test. Does Ukraine accept it or not? Does other NATO member states accept it or not? And definitely any of NATO member states can put situation on hold, but nobody can close a NATO door for Ukraine.
Petro Poroshenko, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us here at BBC News. Just as we were hearing the last answer, let me tell you, the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, has just said, listening to J.D. Vance's speech a little earlier, it was as if they're trying to pick a fight with us. So that's quite a response to what the US Vice President told delegates there in Munich a short while ago. We'll have more in just a moment around the world and across the UK. You're watching BBC News.